Thomas Sankara was born on December 21st, 1949 in Yako, a small town in what was then called Upper Volta. Growing up in a large family with 2 elder sisters and 8 younger brothers, Sankara felt a strong sense of responsibility as the eldest son to care for and protect his siblings. His early years were spent in Gawa, a town in the humid southwest, to which his father was transferred as an auxiliary jandarm. Sankara's family resided in a brick house on a scenic hill in Gawa, where other jandarm family also lived. However, as he began primary school, Thomas interacted with local children, sitting alongside them in class and playing together, which broadened his understanding of their lives and the world beyond his immediate surroundings. In the 1950s, Upper Volta was still a colony of France. The territory had initially been conquered by the French army contingent in 1895 and 96 when they drove the Mosi Emperor from Ouagadougou. It took several more years for them to conquer the Bobo, Samo, Lobi, Gurunsi, and other tribes in the region. At the time, the territory was part of the larger French West African colony. Only in 1919 was it formally established as a separate colony called Upper Volta. When Thomas was 11 years old, just a few days before Upper Volta gained its formal independence from France, he and some friends organized their own mock ceremony to lower the French flag and raise the colors of the new nation. That led to a fight between European and African boys. Although Thomas himself was not involved, the school director demanded that his father punished him with a beating, but his father refused. Most of the time, Thomas applied himself seriously to his schoolwork, excelling in maths and French. He went to church often, participated in a church scout troop, and devoted his time to religious studies. Impressed with his energy and eagerness to learn, some of the priests encouraged Thomas to continue his education in a seminary school once he was done with his primary courses. He initially agreed, but he also took the exam required to enter the 6th grade in the secular educational system and passed. His decision to continue his education at a state secondary school proved to be a turning point for him. That step got him out of his father's household, since the nearest school was in Bobo Dioulasso, the country's commercial center. While Sankara continued to focus on his regular studies, Upper Volta was dealing with a political crisis. President Maurice Imigo, who had reluctantly accepted independence, maintained strong ties with France, relying heavily on French advisors in the military and government. As Imigo's rule became increasingly autocratic, he jailed critics, appointed family members to key positions, and indulged in lavish spending, while imposing austerity measures on state employees and cracking down on trade unions. On January 3, 1966, workers launched a general strike, and large crowds of students, unemployed youths, petty traders, and others poured into the streets of Ouagadougou in a veritable popular uprising. After army officers refused to follow the president's orders to crack down on the protesters, President Imigo's fate was sealed. He agreed to resign and handed over power to the army commander, Lieutenant Colonel Sangoule Lamazana. While the capital's events unfolded, Sankara remained focused on his secondary school exams in Bobo Dioulasso. However, he learned via the radio station that Lieutenant Colonel Lamizana had established the country's first military academy in Ouagadougou, offering opportunities for young high school graduates to join the opening class of junior officers. The military's popularity soared after ousting the unpopular president, and some young intellectuals saw it as a potential force for modernization, discipline, and reform. Acceptance into the military academy offered a scholarship, which was crucial for Sankara, as he couldn't afford to further his education. He passed the entrance exam and joined the academic's inaugural class in 1966 at the age of 17, embarking on a military career path that his father had previously taken. He approached his military training with the same dedication as his academic pursuits, though his small stature presented challenges. He worked hard to build his physical strength, and he also discovered that he had a natural talent for leadership, a skill that was highly valued at the academy, which aimed to train new generation of officers for the country's military. The military academy offered a well-rounded education, with civilian professors teaching social sciences, including history and geography. Adama Toure, the academic director, was one of such influential instructors, though Toure held progressive views, but he was cautious about expressing them openly in the conservative environment. His affiliation with the African Independence Party, which was a Marxist group operating in secret, remained hidden until much later. He invited a selected group of students, including Sankara, to engage in informal discussions outside class, exploring topics like imperialism, socialism, and African liberation movements. These conversations introduced Sankara to a revolutionary perspective on Upper Volta and global issues, further shaping his growing political awareness. Besides his official studies at the academy and extracurricular political activities, Sankara also made the time to explore Ouagadougou and widen his network of friends. He pursued his passion for music and played the guitar more often. After completing his military academic studies, Sankara was among the top graduates selected for advanced officer training in Antsirabe, Madagascar in 1969. His training went beyond military standard drills, incorporating subjects like agriculture and development. He was especially interested in techniques for boosting crop yields and improving farmers' lives, ideas he would later implement in his own country. The Malagasy Army innovative approach, which included Green Berets, focused on development work, which left a lasting impression on Sankara, who even requested a year's extension to work with his unit. His political education extended beyond theory as he witnessed revolutionary change firsthand. During his final year in Madagascar, the country erupted in widespread unrest marked by peasant revolts, general strikes, and massive protests against the conservative government. The turmoil ultimately led to a military takeover, paving the way for more radical officers to seize power. When Sankara finally returned to Upper Volta in October 1973, he was a trained officer ready to command. But his head was also bursting with new notions of how an institution, such as the army, could be used to promote development and of the need for wider political and social changes. Now 24 years old and a second lieutenant, Sankara received his first command to train new recruits in Bopo-Dioulasso. He transformed the military training program by ditching outdated French method in favor of a more modern approach. He combined military drills with civic education, inspired by his experience in Madagascar. On Saturdays, recruits attended classes on topics like citizen rights, duties, and governance, while Sundays were reserved for sport. Initially, the recruits resisted, but soon they grew engaged in the discussions. Sankara's innovative work in Bopo-Dioulasso gained attention, but was cut short when he was transferred to Ouagadougou in March 1974. As part of the Army's engineering corps, he utilized his technical skills acquired in Madagascar, overseeing infrastructure projects nationwide. However, he was dismayed by corruption among officials and officers who embezzled funds or favored relatives in lucrative contracts. Sankara spoke out against these practices, targeting high-ranking individuals, but faced indifferences from his superiors, who began to view him as a nuisance. In December 1974, a brief border war between Upper Volta and Mali erupted, sparked by a long-standing dispute over a contested region. Sankara was deployed to the border, where he led a successful ambush, capturing the Malian soldiers. The action earned him the press coverage and a war hero label. However, Sankara himself never touted this image, privately viewing the conflict as a senseless clash between two impoverished nations driven by arbitrary colonial borders rather than genuine interests. In 1976, President Lamizana appointed Sankara, now a full lieutenant, to lead a new National Commando Training Center in Po, near the Ghanaian border. Over the next 4 years, Sankara developed innovative training programs, building on his earlier work in Bopo-Dioulasso. As the center's commander, Sankara was able to work independently, shaping the future of the country's special forces. He also prioritized civic education and intellectual development for his soldiers, but faced challenges in Po's resource-scarce environment. Despite the limited resources in Po, he sourced books from Ouagadougou and encouraged intellectual exploration. Sankara also initiated community projects, fostering a sense of social responsibility among his troops. They partnered with NGOs to build wells, and Sankara even helped establish the band, contributing his own guitar skills. The Mrs. Band of Po became a local favorite, performing at weekend dances and events, which brought soldiers and civilians together through music. Since Po was less than 100 miles from the capital, Sankara was able to travel there regularly, both to meet his army superiors and to see his friends. It was during this time that he met Mariam Sameh and they began a romance that led to marriage in 1979. Their simple wedding ceremony took place in a small Catholic church. 2 years later, in August 1981, Mariam gave birth to their first child, Philip, marking a new chapter in Sankara's life. Despite his military and family commitments, Sankara was deeply troubled by Upper Volta's their condition. The country was one of the world's poorest, with a per capita income of just $210 in 1980. Most of the 7 million population lived in rural areas, struggling with illiteracy, limited access to education, and recurring hunger due to droughts and poor agriculture. Life expectancy stood at just 44 years old, severely impacted by widespread malnutrition and disease. Sankara's outrage over Upper Volta's their conditions solidifies his determination to drive change. Through his visit to Ouagadougou and training missions abroad, he networked with like-minded individuals, including military personnel like Blaise Compaoré, whom he had met during the war with Mali and later appointed as his deputy at the Po Training Center. Sankara also connected with civilians from various leftist groups, laying the groundwork for a potential revolution. As Sankara watched the country's unrest escalate, he felt the winds of change stirring. The old political elite was in disarray, and strikes and corruption scandals fueled the public anger. But Sankara's experience and study of revolutions taught him patience. He bided his time, gathering strength and allies rather than rushing into action. By the start of the 1980s, President Lamizana's government had been in power for over a decade, characterized by stability but stagnation. Despite relative leniency, the administration failed to address severe social and economic problems, and corruption thrived among the elites. Lamizana criticized the obsession with power and wealth, while his peers worried more about controlling fractious politicians and increasingly restless students and workers. On November 25, 1980, Colonel Sai Ezebo led a group of senior officers in a coup, overthrowing Lamizana's government and seizing control. The Military Committee for the Enhancement of National Progress dissolved the National Assembly, suspended political parties, and detained key officials. Colonel Zebo, a veteran of French military campaigns, cited the erosion of state authority under Lamizana as justification. He promised to restore discipline, fight corruption, and reform the civil service, establishing commissions to investigate past malpractice and propose reforms. The coup was initially popular, and the new government set up by the CMRPN included some progressive nationalist civilian ministers and the support of some trade unions. Sankara took no part in that coup, even though some young officers rallied to the CMRPN and Sankara, and his closest friends were sympathetic to the new regime's promises to root out corruption. They remained suspicious of the political conservatisms of the colonel now in power. As junior officers, they owed allegiance to their superiors, but their ultimate goal was fundamental change. They hesitated to accept public positions in the new government out of concern that to do so might compromise their strategic goal of fundamental political change. The reality was that the radical wings of junior officers represented by Sankara was not yet strong enough to decisively influence events. Nevertheless, the radical support was growing among the ranks of the military, just as their ties were deepening with the student and labor movement and with the civilian revolutionary groups. For the officers of the CMRPN, whose early popularity soon began to fade away, this support was a political asset that could shore up their hold on power. They embarked on a game of seduction to draw in the young radicals. Recognizing Sankara's military skills and growing influence, he was promoted to captain and appointed head of the Army's Operational Division in January 1981. He was then asked to take on a ministerial position in the government, but he refused. Quoting in a letter to Zebo his personal free and conscious decision to not accept any political post. Some of his civilian revolutionary friends agreed with that decision. Others urged Sankara to take up the offer, arguing that outright rejection could expose him and his comrades to retaliation. However, after negotiations, he reluctantly accepted the information ministry post, setting two conditions. that his deputy at the Commando Training Center in Po, Blaise Compaoré, take over as his commander, and that he, Sankara, will serve as a minister for only 2 months until a replacement could be found, although his tenure ultimately stretched to 7 months. On September 13, 1981, Sankara took on his first official role as a government minister. Despite viewing it as temporary, he approached his duties with characteristic seriousness and attention to detail. He assembled a team, including his old friend from secondary school, Fidelio, and several promising young journalists to help him oversee the state media. From day one, Sankara functioned like no other government minister up to that time. With a flair for the dramatic gesture, he pedaled to work each day on a bicycle rather than drive a state-issued car. The sight of a cabinet minister bouncing along Ouagadougou's dusty streets, just like other civilians, sent a clear message of the kind of public servant he intended to be. While all this was happening, political and social tensions in the country were again sharpening, while the CMRPN's promises to clamp down on corruption and profiteering proved to be of limited substance. His reaction to political dissenters took on a much harder edge. Outspoken student activists were detained as labor unions continued to demand for better living and working conditions. The authority responded by suspending the right to strike, dissolving the most militant of the union federations, and ordering the arrest of his central leaders, including Sumin Ture, one of Sankara's secondary school friends. Though, Ture was reported to have evaded arrest by fleeing to Po on a bike. In response to the CMRPN's growing authoritarianism, Sankara and some fellow radical officers secretly mobilized within the military and with students and union allies, laying the groundwork for potential resistance. Sankara also decided that the time had come to end his participation in the government, since the CMRPN had ignored his earlier request to be relieved of his functions. He finally took the initiative himself. He made a dramatic exit from the government on April 12, 1982, resigning live on radio during a conference on African cinema with President Zebo in attendance. In his letter and speech, he lambasted the CMRPN's elitist nature and prioritization of minority interests. He concluded his speech with a powerful call for freedom of expression, warning against silencing the people. The senior officers reacted promptly by arresting Sankara. They also demoted him in rank and deported him to a military camp in the western town of Dedougou. Sankara's public dissent marked a breaking point between the CMRPN's conservative leadership and radical junior officers. The split widened further during the review assembly 3 days after Sankara's exit, leading to the resignation from the CMRPNs of Compaoré and Henry Zongo, another captain close to Sankara. They too were exiled to remote military bases. Despite communication challenges, Sankara's network remained active through the sporadic contact and new leaders. Embodied by the CMRPN's isolation, they were approached by Zebo's rival about joining a potential coup. However, Sankara argued against a purely military takeover, believing it wouldn't drive meaningful change without a clear political platform and civilian support. On the 7th of November 1982, a group of officers led by Commander Gabriel Soumen Urian overthrew Zebo's government and established the Council for the Welfare of the People. Sankara himself happened to be in Ouagadougou at the time of the coup, having received permission to visit his family after the birth of his second son just a few weeks earlier. His presence in the capital fueled inaccurate rumors that he had been a key force behind the coup. Given the leadership vacuum in the CSP, some of his supporters did in fact put forward his name for the presidency, which he declined. After other nominations were blocked due to concerns over conservative leanings, Jean-Baptiste Ouedraogo, a relatively unknown army doctor, was then chosen as a compromise candidate for president. The revolutionary junior officers gained unprecedented influence within the CSP. One of the body's first acts was to restore Sankara, Compaoré and Zongo to their previous ranks as captain. On January 10, 1983, an extraordinary assembly of the CSP acknowledged Sankara's growing political standing by naming him Prime Minister. This time, he readily accepted. He then became the official number 2 to President Ouedraogo and, more importantly, was in charge of coordinating the day-to-day work of various ministers. During his oath-taking ceremony on February 1st, Sankara pledged to serve the people, prioritizing the interests of workers, peasants, students, and democratic organizations. He emphasized that freedom shouldn't enable exploitations or corruption, and called on state officials to connect with ordinary citizens, lead by example, and uphold values of integrity and hard work. As Prime Minister, Sankara had his first opportunity to represent his country on the world stage. His official visit to Libya in February sparked international attention and controversy. Despite concerns from Western powers and neighboring countries, Sankara received a warm welcome from Muammar Gaddafi, who pledged significant aid. The visit drew criticisms and accusations that Sankara was aligned with Libya's president. Sankara also represented Upper Volta at a summit meeting of the developing countries in New Delhi. There he connected with revolutionary leaders like Fidel Castro, Samora Machel, and Maurice Bishop. In his speech, he aligned Upper Volta with the movement's radical wings, expressing support for anti-imperialist government in El Salvador and the Sandinista government in Nicaragua. On March 26, 1983, the CSP organized a mass rally in Ouagadougou featuring its top officials. Sankara delivered a vibrant speech at the rally, defending his foreign policy and criticizing Upper Volta's elites. He also targeted bureaucrats, businessmen, politicians, and traditional leaders, accusing them of corruption and exploitation. When Sankara finished, President Ouedraogo stepped to the podium to read his own speech, but he had been clearly upstaged by his Prime Minister. His own address was delivered in a markedly lower key and had a more moderate message. Same scenario played out at another rally, which was organized in Bobo Dioulasso on May 14th. Sankara drew out a very enthusiastic response from the members of the youth organizations invited to the rally. When President Ouedraogo stood up next to address them, he was greeted at first with silence. Then as he spoke, the crowd began to disperse amid chants of Sankara's name. After the Bobo Dioulasso rally, Sankara's growing influence sparked a backlash. Conservative officers and French authorities took action, and Sankara was arrested on May 17. His allies, including Captain Zongo, were also targeted, but Sankara urged restraint to avoid bloodshed. Meanwhile, commandos in Po, alerted by Velarisome, mobilized and pledged to defy the new authorities. The coup's intended goal of stability quickly unraveled as protests broke out in Ouagadougou. Demonstrators, including student and trade unionists, demanded Sankara's release and chanted anti-imperialist slogans, particularly against France, which was widely regarded as the promoters of the coup. The demonstrations, together with the defiance of the commando based in Po, prompted the authorities to relent, and Sankara was then released from custody in an effort to start negotiations with President Ouedraogo. In hopes of arranging a peaceful political transition and avoiding bloodshed, President Ouedraogo reportedly indicated his willingness to resign and handed over power to Sankara. By 10 p.m. that same day, Sankara announced the overthrow of the government via a radio broadcast, marking the start of a revolutionary era. He declared the formation of the National Council of the Revolution and urged citizens to establish popular committees to support it, promising to prioritize the people's interests and aspiration for freedom, independence, and progress. When Sankara and his colleagues took power on August 4, 1983, they called their leading body the National Council of the Revolution. The name signaled to anyone who might have been in doubt that their goal was sweeping political and social change. The next day, Ouagadougou witnessed a huge welcoming demonstration, the first of many support marches and rallies over the following weeks and months in towns and villages across the country. The response in the street indicated that major sectors of the public, especially young people, had high expectations that finally something would be done to fundamentally refashion their country. At just 33 years old, Sankara swiftly outlined his ambitious vision: a reformed state serving all citizens, eradication of ignorance and exploitation, and the economic development to tackle hunger and poverty. He also called on citizens to organize and take action, alongside the CNL leadership. In response to his first radio broadcast as president, appealing to everyone, man or woman, young or old, to form popular organizations. New committees for the defense of the revolution began to emerge within a few days. As president, Sankara represented both the government and the National Council of the Revolution. The government implemented policy, while the CNL deliberated on key issues and provided guidance. Although the CNL membership was secret, Sankara's influence was paramount, and his charisma made him the public face of the revolution. This video is actually divided into two parts. In my next video, I'll be talking about Sankara's leadership on Upper Volta and how he managed to rule the country for 4 years before his assassination on October 15, 1987. Thank you for watching. Kindly subscribe to this channel for more documentary videos.
Camarades, l'impérialisme, le néocolonialisme, les élèves réactionnaires, les élèves indisciplinés, paresseux, les professeurs carents, les vomissures de la contre-révolution.
2 months after seizing power, Sankara laid out the CNR's ambitious agenda for transformation. He argued that independence had done little to change the lives of ordinary people who had remained trapped in poverty and exploitation. Sankara called out the domestic enemies of progress, including the parasitic classes of reactionary forces, and rallied support among workers, peasants, and the middle class. He described the revolution as democratic and popular, aiming to eradicate imperialist exploitation and modernize the countryside. He envisioned a new state apparatus that would empower the people, with committees for the defense of the revolution playing a key role in driving this transformation. Sankara's concept of democracy focused on direct participation, but the absence of elections and representative bodies was seen as a major limitation. Despite the rhetoric of people's power, the CNR structure was criticized for not providing sufficient channels for citizens to express their concerns and ideas. Most of his speeches, including his October 1983 address, reflected Marx's influence, and he openly admired revolutions in Russia, China, and Cuba. While Sankara read widely, including the Bible and the Quran, and writings by many non-Marxist revolutionaries and other progressive thinkers, he avoided labeling his revolution as socialist or communist, recognizing Upper Volta as underdevelopment and small working class. Instead, he framed the revolution as anti-imperialist, focused on nation building, economic development, and addressing present social issues such as widespread illiteracy, hunger, poverty, and disease. To symbolize that rebirth, the CNR changed the country's name in August 1984 during the first anniversary of his assumption of power. The territory once labeled Upper Volta would henceforth be called Burkina Faso, meaning land of the upright people. This name change symbolized a new era of integrity, pride, and African identity, with citizens now proudly known as Burkinabe. Whatever people thought of Sankara's grand ideas for the country, they soon became aware that his day-to-day conduct was markedly different from that of any previous president. At times, with theoretical symbols, he openly disdains the customary pomp and ceremony that generally come with high office. Official portraits of the president, so common in public buildings across Africa, were prohibited. Young activists were discouraged from chanting his name, and he was normally driven to meetings and public events not in a limousine, but in modest cars. Once in a week, he played soccer with his advisors and staff, and passersby could see him dressed in shorts and jersey. Such informality was designed to send the message that leaders should be modest and that, especially in such a poor country, they should not live the high life. He publicly declared all the sources of income and assets of himself and his wife. He clearly had not used his position to amass wealth. His 2 sons remained enrolled in public schools, while his wife continued to report daily for her job at the government shipping agency, where she was a transportation specialist. His parents lived in the same house they occupied before in Ouagadougou, and he also noted in an interview with a Burkinabe journalist that, "I've told those close to me that they should in no way try to profit from the fact that one of their relatives now happens to be president. Whatever they may earn, let them earn it because they've worked for it, not because they are members of the president's family. Neither my wife, nor my brothers and my sisters, nor my other relatives or my children when they grow up a little bit more." Under Sankara's leadership, new projects were being made in the country, and with the help of ordinary citizens who seemed to willingly embrace Sankara's approach, they quickly mobilized in their local communities to build new schools, health clinics, and other facilities. The CNR also prioritized instilling a culture of public accountability, emphasizing that state property was sacred and that civil servants were required to serve the people, not themselves. To root out corruption, People's Revolutionary Tribunals were established to punish wrongdoings and promote moral integrity in public life. The first trial in January 1984 was that of General Lanuzana, who was charged with diverting money from a special presidential fund. After hearing extensive testimony that Lamizana had used the fund mainly to help a variety of individuals, not for his own personal enrichment, the panel decided by majority vote to release him. A number of government officials also received jail sentences, with Colonel Sai Ezepo drawing an 8-year term for embezzlement, illicit enrichment, and tax fraud. Overall, about 40 tribunal sessions were held under the CNR, most of them taking up multiple cases, with nearly 1,000 individuals trialed. The message was clear: public office holders would be expected to manage public resources and affairs for the benefit of the people, not for personal gain. This marks a shift in perspective, where state office would be viewed as a public trust, prioritizing the interests of the population. As part of austerity measures, government ministers and senior officials had their expense accounts scrapped. A significant portion of the government vehicle fleet was sold, with only small cars retained for official use. Strict rules were also put in place governing personal use of assigned vehicles, prohibiting officials from keeping them outside work hours without permission to prevent misuse. In August 1985, the CNR abruptly dissolved the government, reassigning cabinet ministers to rural farming projects. This bold move, repeated over the next 2 years, aimed to break the notion that high-ranking positions were lifelong appointments. Sankara described it as a revolutionary pedagogy formula, emphasizing that leaders should view themselves as public servants, prepared to take on any role. The CNR aimed to transform the military from a tool of the elite to a servant of the people, emphasizing the need to decolonize the army. Sankara stressed the importance of educating soldiers to elevate their political and civic awareness, noting that a soldier without training is just a criminal in power. This approach sought to redefine the military's role in the society and promote a sense of social responsibility among its members. Sankara's earlier experiments in linking military training with public service and development work was made systematic. Military bases across the country started farms to grow food and raise livestock, engaged in tree planting to combat deforestation, cleaned up trash from towns and villages, and also built infrastructure and provided essential services. Aside from its practical impact, this kind of activity had an educational function to help prevent soldiers from developing superior attitude and to convince civilians that the army, alongside its usual functions, could also contribute to the country's economic advancement. The CNR envisioned a new state that would be less corrupt, more effective, and reach beyond the cities to serve the rural population. Unlike previous regimes that relied on traditional chiefs and local notables, the Sankara government sought to extend its reach and provide public services to the countryside. The Committees for the Defense of the Revolution played a crucial role in this effort, mobilizing local communities, supporting the government, and representing revolutionary power in villages, neighborhoods, and workplaces. They operated through a General Assembly, where members gathered to discuss key issues and make decisions by majority vote. These assemblies elected 9 members' bureaus to oversee activities and coordinate the higher-level bodies. Notably, the CDRs were inclusive and representative of the broader community, comprising individuals from humble backgrounds, including those who were illiterate and only spoke their local languages. The CDR also played their role in direct competition with the traditional chiefs. This was the first time in the country's post-colonial history that institutions other than the chieftaincy or council of elders existed in villages, representing at least the beginning of the shift in authority to commoners. The central government itself stepped in to weaken the position of the chiefs. In December 1983, Sankara declared the abolition of all laws on the designation of chiefs and their territorial authority and stripped them of any remaining state benefits or right to collect taxes, tributes, or labor services. The CNR initiated national mobilization campaigns to tackle problems of national importance. These campaigns included volunteers, CDR activists, and civil servants. They focused on building irrigation canals in the Sohu River Valley to support agriculture and also organized people to plant millions of trees to combat deforestation and desertification. The Battle of the Rail campaign, launched in February 1985, aimed to extend the railway line from Ouagadougou to the isolated northeast. Despite the World Bank and other donor agencies consider the extension of the railway to be uneconomical and therefore declined to fund it, the Sankara government hoped to change their minds by building an additional 100 kilometers of track from Ouagadougou to Kaya through its own financing and labor mobilizations. Significant progress was made, with about a third of the distance covered within 7 months, and the track had been laid close to Kaya by October 1987. Not all commandos' mobilization were so productive. In 1985, Sankara proclaimed a White City campaign to mobilize townships to paint their houses white as part of a broader effort to improve urban appearances. Many residents strongly resented the effort. However, they objected to the cost of the paint, but mostly they thought the choice of color was ridiculous. With winds blowing around the fine Ocha sound of the Sahel, not much stayed white for a very long time, and the campaign was soon abandoned. The Alpha Commando Literacy Campaign, launched in 1986, successfully mobilized volunteers to teach basic literacy and numeracy to around 30,000 rural people. This campaign, which lasted for 2.5 months, involved students, CDR activists, civil servants, and teachers, and enabled about half of the participants to acquire functional literacy skills. By most estimates, the greatest triumph was Vaccination Commando, a child immunization campaign. Previous vaccination campaigns were carried out strictly through the government's regular and very limited health services, which only reached a tiny fraction of children, even in Ouagadougou. Reflecting Sankara's typical impatience with slow bureaucratic procedures, the cabinet decided in September 1984 to launch a commando-style campaign to vaccinate most of Burkinabe's children against the key childhood killers like measles, meningitis, and yellow fever, and to do so over a period of only 2 weeks. Just 2 months later, foreign donor agencies advised against such a fast and extensive campaign and suggested a more cautious and measured approach. The United Nations Children Funds and a few other donors agreed to support the effort, although with serious misgivings about its feasibility. Prior to Sankara's presidency, Burkinabe women faced significant social and economic barriers with limited opportunities for mobilization, political organization, or engagement with state institutions. Traditional patriarchal relations relegated women to a subordinate status, with men controlling many aspects of their lives. The Sankara government prioritized women emancipation, emphasizing it as a central goal. The administration implemented various measures to promote women's rights, including literacy classes, healthcare initiatives, support for women's cooperatives, and a new family code aimed at protecting women's rights and combating oppressive practices. The Sankara's government exercised its authority to appoint women to key positions, breaking with tradition in Burkina Faso and beyond. Women were appointed to significant cabinet posts, such as Ministers of Family Affairs, Culture, Health, and Budget. Notably, the number of women in the cabinet increased to 5, representing about 20% of the total, a significant departure from previous governments. They also received military training, a particularly radical notion in such a society. So women were recruited directly into the armed forces, with a few rising to become tank drivers and Air Force pilots. Such appointments sent a strong signal of encouragement to women at all levels. Sankara's vision for Burkina Faso's economic transformation focused on improving the lives of its people. When asked about development, he prioritized practical initiatives, building irrigation dams for food production, constructing schools and health clinics, and establishing small stores in rural areas. His goal was simple: ensure 2 meals a day and access to drinking water for all Burkinabes. The Sankara's government focused on basic improvements didn't mean it lacked ambition. In his 1983 speech, Sankara outlined the grand vision: building an independent, self-sufficient and planned economy, serving a democratic society. This goal was echoed in the 1986 5-year plan. The slogan, self-sufficiency, did not mean cutting Burkina Faso's national economy off from the rest of the world, but it did imply reorientating the economy towards domestic markets and interests, not isolation. The National Council of the Revolution pursued a gradual transformation focused on self-reliance, equity, rural development, and environmental sustainability. It emphasized using the local resources over foreign aid, reducing privileges of the elites to benefit the poor, prioritizing rural areas in funding and integrating environmental care into development. Because the government had limited funds, the budget ministry under Sankara focused on cutting unnecessary and extravagant spending, starting with the privileges of the top officials. Sankara promoted transparency by holding public budget discussions and encouraged citizens to suggest ways to save more. He also condemned corruption, laziness, and waste among civil servants. To increase revenue, the CNI improved tax collection mainly from property owners and abolished the unfair colonial-era head tax that burdened poor villagers. While austerity measures across Africa typically hurt the poor and spared the elite, in Sankara's Burkina Faso, the opposite occurred. Government cutbacks targeted privileges of the powerful, allowing the poor to benefit instead. In 1984, Sankara's government passed an agrarian reform law that nationalized all land. While most villagers' farming rights remained unchanged, the reform ended the threat of losing land to creditors or speculators, giving farmers greater security. Sankara stressed that land should be used productively, not bought and sold for profit. He also launched the Tree Struggles campaign, which was to raise environmental awareness and stop the rapid loss of vegetation. The first campaign targeted uncontrolled tree cutting for firewood, introducing strict licensing for wood merchants and limiting cutting to designated areas, with violators facing persecution. The second campaign banned uncontrolled bush burning for farmland clearing, which often led to destructive fires during the dry season. While the third addressed free-ranging livestock, warning herders to prevent animals from damaging crops. Under the slogan, "Let's produce and consume Burkinabe," Sankara's government promoted the use of local materials and encouraged citizens to buy locally made products. Industries were urged to replace import with local ingredients, such as using maize in bread and sorghum in beer. These measures boosted domestic production and created new market opportunities for local farmers.
Alors, chers frères, avec le soutien de tous, nous pourrons faire la paix chez nous. Nous pourrons également utiliser ces immenses potentialités pour développer l'Afrique, parce que notre sous-sol sont riches. Nous avons suffisamment de bras et nous avons un marché immense, très vaste, du nord au sud, de l'est à l'ouest. Nous avons suffisamment de capacités intellectuelles pour créer, ou tout au moins prendre la technologie et la science partout où nous pourrons les trouver. Monsieur le Président, faisons en sorte que nous mettions au point ce front uni d'Addis Abeba contre la dette. Faisons en sorte que ce soit à partir d'Addis Abeba que nous décidions de limiter la course aux armements entre pays faibles et pauvres. Les gourdins et les coutelas que nous achetons sont inutiles. Faisons en sorte également que le marché africain soit le marché des Africains. Produire en Afrique, transformer en Afrique et consommer en Afrique. Produisons ce dont nous avons besoin et consommons ce que nous produisons au lieu d'importer. Le Burkina Faso est venu vous exposer ici la cotonnade produite au Burkina Faso, tissée au Burkina Faso, cousue au Burkina Faso pour habiller les Burkinabés. Ma délégation et moi-même, nous sommes habillés par nos tisserands, nos paysans. Il n'y a pas un seul fil qui vienne de l'Europe ou de l'Amérique. Je ne fais pas un défilé de mode, mais je voudrais simplement dire que nous devons accepter de vivre africain. C'est la seule façon de vivre libre et de vivre digne. Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président. La patrie ou la mort, nous vaincrons.
Sankara consistently challenged France's political influence. His 1986 confrontation with President Mitterrand symbolized this stance, but he had already criticized French actions at the United Nations, opposing France's intervention in Chad, calling for Mayotte to be returned to the Comoros, and supporting the Kanak independence movement in New Caledonia. Sankara also said Burkina Faso's relationship with France should be based on equality and mutual benefits, free from French paternalism and Burkinabe inferiority. The Burkina Faso's government sought greater independence from France, by expanding its international partnership. It secured new aid agreements with countries like the Netherlands, Japan, and Canada, and strengthened ties with China and the Soviet Union. Sankara also accepted assistance while still openly criticizing actions he opposed, such as the Soviet Union intervention in Afghanistan and the poor quality of some Libyan aid. He strongly supported Pan-African unity and the goals of the African Union, but he knew many African leaders lacked the will to act collectively. At the annual summit meetings of the African Union and during his travels, he frequently pushed his counterparts to turn their wars into real action. He was most passionate about opposing apartheid in South Africa and Namibia. He saw the regime's persistence, despite global pressures, as an insult to all Africans. For him, Africa could not be truly united or progress politically and economically, while the majority in those countries remained oppressed. Early in his rule, Sankara's government honored Nelson Mandela by renaming a major street after him and symbolically granting him a Burkinabe passport, claiming him as a citizen. Nelson Mandela, who was a South African anti-apartheid activist and politician, was arrested and imprisoned in 1962. The Sankara's government's closest regional ally was Ghana, a relationship that began when Sankara was Prime Minister in 1983. Ghana had recently undergone its own revolution, led by Flight Lieutenant Jerry John Rawlings and a coalition of junior officers and leftist civilians who, like Sankara, promoted revolutionary and anti-imperialist ideals. Shortly after the CNR came to power, Ghana's revolutionary leader, Jerry Rawlings, visited Sankara, showing stronger support. Sankara later revealed that Rawlings had backed the Burkinabe revolution with military, political and diplomatic help. The two countries held joint military exercises, both Union in 1984 and again in 1985, to display their solidarity. Burkina Faso maintained fairly good relations with Benin and generally cordial ties with Niger, but its relations with Togo, Mali and Côte d'Ivoire were tense. These three countries were aligned with France, hosted Burkinabe opponents of Sankara, and feared that Burkina Faso's revolution might spread. They sometimes blame Ouagadougou for their own internal unrest, as Togo did after a failed coup in 1986. Côte d'Ivoire's government was uneasy about Sankara's revolution, partly because around 2 million Burkinabe lived in the country. His longtime president, Félix Houphouët-Boigny, was a strong French ally, which further contributed to the tension. Given Côte d'Ivoire's economic and political weight in the region and the presence of large Burkinabe citizens in that country, the Sankara's government was careful in its dealings with President Houphouët-Boigny. A first planned visit by Sankara to Côte d'Ivoire in May 1984 was cancelled when the Ivorian government refused to let Sankara visit Abidjan, apparently out of concern over the welcome he might receive from his own habitat. A visit was finally organized the following February, not in Abidjan, but in the political capital, Yamoussoukro, a much more smaller town. Some 18 hours before Sankara's arrival, a bomb exploded in the hotel suite where he was supposed to stay. But the visit went ahead anyway, and Sankara met with Houphouët-Boigny. Though it was not in Abidjan, but thousands of Ivorians and Burkinabe nevertheless turned out to greet Sankara. Although relations between Burkina Faso and Côte d'Ivoire appeared polite, Houphouët-Boigny quietly sought influence inside Burkina Faso. He made progress in 1985 when Chantal Terrasson, who he had raised in his household, married Burkina Faso's defense minister, Captain Blaise Compaoré. Sankara pushed to renew the fight against corruption, shifting the focus from past officials to those currently in power. He worried about dishonesty not only among civil servants and CDR members, but even within his own leadership. He created the People's Commission for the Prevention of Corruption in February to monitor the incomes and assets of top officials and identify anyone living beyond their means. Suspicious cases would be investigated by police and, if necessary, sent to a revolutionary tribunal. The goal was to protect the revolution from corruption. He set the example by declaring assets of himself and his wife. He later acknowledged that past anti-corruption efforts were still fragile because officials faced constant temptation. He explained that people often try to bribe leaders under the pretense of helping the country. He also hoped that structures like the CPPC would keep officials honest by reminding them that they would eventually have to account for their actions. Sankara also said that he wasn't targeting anyone specifically, but his colleagues later noted that he was worried about the luxurious lifestyle of Compaore's wife Chantal. The former Interior Minister, Ernest recalled that Compaore wasn't very committed to fighting corruption and was criticized for hiding some of his wife's assets, such as an expensive gold clock gifted to her by the Côte d'Ivoire's president. Although personal ambition and corruption played roles in the events leading to Sankara's death, the coup plotters also likely relied on support from the broader groups who were unhappy with Sankara's reforms, like the social elite, major traders, land speculators, and traditional chiefs who had lost influence under Sankara's revolution. They had strong motives to see him removed. In the months before the coup, anonymous flyers circulated urging the Mosi population to oppose Sankara, portraying him as an outsider and subtly promoting Compaore, who is of a Mosi tribe, as the preferable leader. Sankara understood that the real danger to African revolutions came from the petty bourgeoisies. On the morning of October 15, 1987, Sankara met the Belarusian to discuss rising tensions within the leadership, especially between himself and Blaise Compaore. He also drafted a speech calling for a purification of the CNL to address growing distrust and factionalism, but it was a speech he would never get to deliver. That afternoon, Sankara had a scheduled meeting with a small team of advisors. They gathered at about 4:15 p.m. at the old Conseil de l'État headquarters, which for some time had served as an office of the CNL. The meeting was underway for only a brief time when shooting erupted in the small courtyard outside. Sankara's driver and two of his bodyguards were the first to be killed. Upon hearing the gunfire, everyone inside the room quickly took cover. Sankara then got up and told his aides to stay inside for their own safety, saying, "It is me they want." He left the room, hands raised, to face the assailant, but was shot several times and died without saying anything more. If his exit from the room was intended to save his comrades inside, it failed. The gunmen, all dressed in military uniform, entered the meeting room and sprayed with automatic weapon fire. Everyone inside was killed, except for Alona Traore, who survived his wounds and later gave the only eyewitness account of the attack. Compaore denied that he had issued orders for Sankara's assassination and claimed to have been at home in bed ill at the time of the killing. Many found it hard to believe that his men would have acted on their own and they were Compaore's men. The killers included Sergeant Hyacinthe Kafando, Compaore's aide-de-camp. He and the other known assailants all served directly under Captain Gilbert de Denry, the then commander of the Po Commando base and soon to become head of Compaore's military security force. Because of their actions, Compaore was no longer just the number two. By the evening of that day, he was the new president of Burkina Faso.
C'est des regrets?
D'avoir perdu un ami, bien sûr. Et un regret aussi qu'à un moment de sa vie, il ait pensé à nous liquider. Dommage. Ouais, c'est dommage.
Sankara's revolution had many foreign enemies, leading analysts to suspect outside involvement in the 1987 coup. France was considered the most likely culprit, given his earlier role in removing Sankara as prime minister in 1983. The governments of Togo and Mali, both aligned with France, supported opponents of Sankara's government, but Côte d'Ivoire was seen as the most likely to influence a coup, especially given Ifeanyi in close relationship with Compaore. Some also suspected Libya's Gaddafi, whose relations with Sankara had cooled, while his ties with Compaore grew stronger after the coup. The Compaore's government ruled Burkina Faso for 27 years, until he was ousted by a popular uprising in 2014, which forced him to resign and flee to Ivory Coast. Thank you for watching. Kindly subscribe to this channel for more documentary videos. This is actually the full version of my two-part series. You can watch the individual parts here.